Hi class, welcome to lesson 5 of unit 7. This is the beginning of our discussion of the aftermath of the Civil War, and it's going to be a two-parter. This part's going to be about the beginning of Reconstruction. It's going to be about the different, if you will, political haggling that happens between the executive branch, the president, and the Congress, and I will basically discuss the different Reconstruction plans that are going to be put in place. President Lincoln is going to have his own plan in mind, and it is going to be very reconciliatory. President Johnson is going to be even more forgiving in some ways. After Lincoln is assassinated, I'll talk about that assassination in a little while. And then the radical Republicans are ultimately in Congress going to take over on Reconstruction. And when they take over, they are going to take a much more aggressive and more revolutionary tone, a more punishing tone towards the southern states. But they will all three have different plans regarding Reconstruction. So this is going to be a lecture that's full of political drama. If you've taken a civics class, you're really going to see the clash between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So first off, what is Reconstruction? Well, make sure you highlight this term. This is an important term to know. The Reconstruction period was the time period that lasted for about 12 years after the conclusion of the Civil War, and it was a time whenever the federal government was readmitting southern states into the Union and deciding the terms by which they would be readmitted. And again, Abraham Lincoln's going to have one stance on Reconstruction, Andrew Johnson's going to have a different stance, and a group known as the Radical Republicans will have a different stance as well. So the major issues of Reconstruction are going to be the status of ex-slaves, the ex-Confederates. What's going to happen to the ex-Confederates? Are they going to be viewed as treasonous? Are they going to be executed? What's going to happen to the Confederate leaders? What's going to be done with the Southern economy now that slavery has ended in the rebelling states? Is slavery going to be destroyed everywhere else? And the answer will be yes, and that will be the 13th Amendment. More on that later. And again, one big question is, what do you demand of the South? Do you make it very easy for the South to be readmitted into the Union, or do you really squeeze a lot out of them now that they've lost in their attempt to secede from the Union? So again, depending on who's in charge of the government, who has the most influence, that's going to determine the course of Reconstruction. And at first, the executive branch under Lincoln will take the lead. Then once he dies, a much weaker President, Andrew Johnson, will try to implement his plan, but ultimately it will be the Congress that will decide this under the lead of the Radical Republicans. More on them later. Okay, so for the first of the Reconstruction planners, and you'll see a pattern in the notes where you have the dark dotted lines. Those are the boxes that have the Reconstruction plans. So the first Reconstruction planner will be Abraham Lincoln, and he will have what's known as the 10% plan, which I will explain shortly. And this plan overall was much more it wanted to emphasize reconciliation with the South. It did not want to really punish the South. In Lincoln's view, this was never a war between two countries. This was more like family infighting, and now the family infighting had ended. Reconciling between the family members was what needed to be emphasized the most. Now, Congress at this point is going to have a lot of people known as radical Republicans that don't exactly like Lincoln's stance of being so forgiving of the southern states. But Abraham Lincoln, by this point, was quite an influential person because he was now literally, he could be called the president that preserved the Union, that saved the country. So Congress, even if they didn't always agree with him, they absolutely respected him. For that reason, they had to kind of go along with some of the things that he said. They will not respect Andrew Johnson at all. Okay, and neither will the country, by the way. Okay, so the details of this plan is basically only 10% of the entire state's population had to pledge allegiance back to the United States, and again, against the failed Confederacy. And think about how forgiving that is. Imagine you have a class of 30 students, and in that class, every single student is involved in a major cheating scandal, and the teacher is going to write up every single student in the class because they were all involved, and then the teacher says, well, if only 3 people in this class, 10% of you, promise to never cheat again, and you pledge to be honest from here on out, then I will forgive everyone. That's extremely lenient, and that is how lenient Lincoln wanted to be. 10% is a very low threshold. Only 1 out of 10 had to pledge allegiance to the United States, and then that would be basically representative of the whole state, and the state would be readmitted to the Union. Does anyone get punished? Only the leaders. Everybody else would be given amnesty, which is basically a mass pardon. So everybody that had brought arms, had brought weapons to fight against the Union, had basically committed treason, all of them would be forgiven except for leaders like Jefferson Davis, except for leaders like Robert E. Lee, etc. But everyone else, your common people, would be forgiven. So this was an extremely lenient, forgiving plan meant to reconcile with the South and put the Civil War behind the country as soon as possible. Had Lincoln lived, that might have become a reality. But he will die. Basically, he comes up with this Reconstruction plan as the Civil War was winding down, and he'll die within a week of Robert E. Lee surrendering. So his plan isn't going to really be fulfilled very much. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on in Congress at the time. At the time, you had a group of Republicans known as the Radical Republicans. They were the most liberal of Republicans. They were the ones that wanted to punish the South for the Civil War. They were the ones that wanted to blame the South for the Civil War. They were not interested in reconciling. They were interested in revolutionizing and punishing the South. Abraham Lincoln would have been considered a moderate Republican, not a radical Republican. But again, even the most liberal of Republicans respected Lincoln because he was the man that had preserved the Union, despite being unpopular in doing so, even among the Northern citizens for a long time. Now he has hero status, if you will. The leader of the Radical Republicans will be a man named Thaddeus Stevens. And Thaddeus Stevens genuinely cared about black civil rights. In fact, he had a wife, a black wife that he had a relationship with. Even in northern states, oftentimes interracial marriage was not allowed at the time. So even if on paper he wasn't technically married to her, they did have an ongoing relationship. She posed as his house servant, but they really were basically husband and wife. So he himself was involved in an interracial marriage long before that would have been considered acceptable. So the reason of me telling you that is that this man, Thaddeus Stevens, which he's pictured here, he absolutely genuinely cared about black equality, black civil rights. And he really wants to push for that with his Reconstruction plan. Again, the radical Republicans in general wanted to get rid of slavery, not just in the states that had rebelled, but even in the border states. In other words, get rid of slavery everywhere. And Abraham Lincoln was starting to lean that way as well. He had seen that after the Emancipation Proclamation, he had still gotten elected to a second term. So now Abraham Lincoln will also be bold when it comes to getting rid of slavery. And then the question is, what do you do with slaves? Do you give them partial rights? Do you give them totally equal rights? Do you give them voting rights? And the radical Republicans wanted to give black Americans, the freedmen, the ex-slaves, full equality and voting rights. So they did feel, under Thaddeus Stevens' leadership, that Lincoln was too lenient when it came to readmitting southern states. They thought that 10% was way too little of a number. At the same time, they did respect him. And so what they will do is they will propose with what's known as the Wade-Davis bill, upping the threshold to get back into the Union. They're going to say that 10% of the state is too little. Let's make it be 50% of the state. Now, Abraham Lincoln, being politically savvy, knew that the southern states were still not very happy. They were pretty bitter about the way the Civil War had gone, the fact that they had lost, and he knew that 50% would be asking too much. And so even though that might have been, by our standards today, a more fair proposition of 50%. He knew that in reality it would not work. He knew that he could not get 50% of a state to agree to pledge allegiance to the United States, especially with the Civil War it was just ending. And so he rejects this bill. He says it's too harsh. He's going to say to the radical Republicans, yes, I know that I know that you want to revolutionize and punish the South, but if we're going to get the Civil War behind us, we need to be very lenient, very nice now. So he's going to reject this bill. And the radical Republicans don't like this, but again, Lincoln was well respected. You will see, though, when Andrew Johnson becomes president, the radical Republicans are going to try to run all over him, and eventually they will run all over him. Okay. So you do see multiple amendments to the Constitution getting passed during this time period. They are known as the Civil War Amendments. The first one of these will be known as the 13th Amendment. And this really builds on the Emancipation Proclamation. If you look in these notes, you'll see these charts that are kind of double-lined. Each one of these double-lined charts is going to be one of the amendments. So the 13th Amendment, what it does, again, is it expands on the Emancipation Proclamation, and it is going to abolish slavery in the entire United States, in all the southern states, all the border states. At this point, it is going to abolish slavery everywhere. And so at this point, the question over whether or not these freedmen would stay free once the war was done, it was pretty much answered. And so almost 4 million people that had been freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, or basically other people also, they're all going to be freed at this point. So slavery is done. And so the federal government at this point, now that they have ended slavery, they have to decide what to do with the freedmen. You have 4 million people in your country that all of a sudden are considered to be not property anymore. And the question is, do you treat them as immigrants that have not become citizens yet? Do they become citizens but with limited rights? And that's what the 14th and 15th Amendments are going to answer. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are sometimes called the Civil War Amendments. Sometimes they're called the Reconstruction Amendments. Either way is accurate. So the first one, the 13th, ends slavery, and then the next two are going to deal with the role of these freedmen and the rights of these freedmen. More on that coming up later. So the first thing that you'll see the radical Republicans do, and this will happen when Lincoln is still alive, is you will see the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau. This will be a federal agency that's set up to help freedmen, which again is a name given to ex-slaves, both men and women, and it is set up to help freedmen adjust to being free. You have to remember that the people that have been enslaved have been denied the right to learn or the ability to learn how to read and write. They really had their skills were limited to agricultural skills largely, picking cotton, for example. And so this federal agency is going to be set up to give these freedmen what they needed to adjust to being free because they were not used to this. They were given food and shelter, medicine, job opportunities, and very importantly, they're going to be given education. If you look at the picture, you can see these freed men and women learning how to read and write. They're being taught this. There is one other thing that I don't have in the notes that's very important to think about, and that there was this rumor that freedmen were going to get their own piece of land. And this land was supposed to come from these wealthy Confederate leaders like Robert E. Lee or like Jefferson Davis. And the idea was that once that land was taken from the Confederate leaders that were going to be going to jail, then that land could be divvied up, and then each freedman or woman could have their own piece of land to work on, and therefore they could be an independent farmer and not be dependent on anyone else. There's this rumor of, quote unquote, 40 acres and a mule that's going to be given to all the freedmen. In the end, that promise will not be fulfilled, and that's going to be very bad for the Southern freedmen. I'll talk more about that later on. Had the Freedmen's Bureau stuck around and had fulfilled all of its promises, you would have seen much more advances for Black Americans in the South than you ultimately end up seeing. In the end, for the most part, Reconstruction is going to be a failure. at least in reality. On paper, it will have some successes like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but in reality, it will be a failure. So Abraham Lincoln is going to end up dying early on in the Reconstruction process, and with that go all the hopes of having a reconciliatory Reconstruction process. So famously, Abraham Lincoln, on April the 14th of 1865, less than a week after Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, he's going to be attending a play. And while attending the play, a famous actor at the time, who oftentimes acted at this playhouse, is going to kill Abraham Lincoln. So John Wilkes Booth is going to have much more access to Abraham Lincoln than he should have had, but because he was a celebrity that was known to be in the theater so often, he was basically not stopped by security like he should have been. Now, in reality, John Wilkes Booth was part of a larger conspiracy that involved many different people, and the original plan was to basically kidnap Abraham Lincoln. It was to kidnap the vice president. It was to kidnap the Secretary of State, hold them for ransom, and that way they could force the South to surrender. But what ends up happening is Lee surrenders to Grant, and once Lee surrenders to Grant, you will see the plan change. And so John Wilkes Booth is going to change the plan from a kidnapping for ransom to an assassination. Now, what's interesting is that Booth is the only one that actually pulls off the assassination. The person that was supposed to kill Vice President Johnson is going to fail. The person that's supposed to kill the Secretary of State, William Seward, is going to fail. Only John Wilkes Booth actually succeeds in getting into Ford's Theater, and as you can see from the front picture, he is going to shoot and kill Lincoln. He's going to shoot him in the back of the head. Now, whenever he does this, it's going to be one of the most traumatic events in American history. It's the first time ever that a president has been assassinated, and what happens is Booth is going to leap from the balcony. If you look here, you can see the balcony that Lincoln was watching the play from. He's going to leap from the balcony, and I believe he breaks his left leg or left ankle in the process when he lands on the stage. And witness accounts say that he either yelled out Sic Semper Tyrannis, which means basically thus always the tyrants. He's calling Lincoln a tyrant. Other accounts say that he yelled revenge for the South. And ultimately Booth thought he was doing the South a favor. He wasn't. Because when he kills Lincoln, he also kills the chance of having a leader of Reconstruction that wants to be forgiving of the South. And what you're going to see is that the South is about to actually get much worse treatment once the radical Republicans kind of take power away from the next president, Andrew Johnson. More on that later on. But what ends up happening to Booth, the popular story is that he ends up running away. He ends up meeting a doctor whose last name was Mudd, Dr. Mudd, and Dr. Mudd is going to basically set Booth's leg so that he can continue his escape. And so that's where the phrase "your name is Mudd" comes from, because that doctor was not very well liked by a lot of Americans after the fact, at least Northern Americans. Eventually, Booth, the story goes that he's going to be cornered after running for several days. He's going to be cornered in a barn. They're going to set the barn on fire. They end up shooting into the barn, and one of the shots hits Booth, and Booth ends up dying during his capture. So he will not be executed like the other co-conspirators here. So if you look at the picture down here at the bottom, you'll see the other three men that were supposed to be involved. One of them was supposed to kill the vice president, one the Secretary of State, one was supposed to do the timing of the whole thing, and then here you'll notice a woman. First woman ever executed by the federal government, and she'll be executed. Her name, I believe, was Mary Surratt, and she was executed because all the conspiring happened at her house. So she was in on it. So at this point, after the assassination of what some historians consider to be the greatest president ever, the worst president, or one of the worst presidents ever, comes into office. His name, Andrew Johnson. So again, Andrew Johnson will not get the respect of the radical Republicans, and you'll see that very shortly. A little bit of background on Andrew Johnson is that he was a Southerner. He was pretty much the only Southern politician that did not leave the Union whenever all the Southern states were leaving. He was from Tennessee. So the Southern states didn't like him or respect him because he had stayed as part of the Union. In fact, the only reason that Andrew Johnson was the vice president for Lincoln was because Lincoln was trying to bring in border states during the 1864 election. But honestly, the Northerners didn't like him either because he was a Southerner. What's also interesting about Andrew Johnson is that he was a white supremacist. He did not care about the rights of freed blacks. But at the same time, because he had grown up very poor, he doesn't really care for the elite white members of Southern society either. So basically, Andrew Johnson doesn't seem to like very many people, and there's not very many people that like him either, and he's actually nicknamed a man without a country. The North doesn't like him, the South doesn't like him. Why did I give you that background? Because it will help you understand why he had the plan that he had. So his Reconstruction plan will be known as the 10% plus plan. He's going to basically mimic a lot of Lincoln's plan, but add on some parts to it. So he is also going to try to emphasize reconciliation with the South, but not necessarily with Southern leaders, and I'll get into that in a moment. So just like Abraham Lincoln said, only 10% of the state had to pledge allegiance to the United States in order for the entire state to be readmitted into the Union. What's interesting, though, is that he is going to offer not just amnesty or pardoning for Confederates, but also for the leaders, like the generals. Now, here's what you had to do in order to get the special pardon. You had to go to the White House and basically beg Andrew Johnson for this pardon. And so what Andrew Johnson is going to do is he's going to waste a lot of time, and instead of being a leader, he is going to basically be getting people to suck up to him, these ex-Confederate leaders, and basically beg him for forgiveness for leading the rebellion against the United States. So basically, again, because he had grown up as a poor white in the South, and because he didn't like the Southern elite members of society, he spends a lot of his time getting them to beg him for forgiveness. So he's not a very good leader, and he makes this way too personal. But they were able to apply for pardons. If you ever read the pardons or the letters where they ask for a pardon, they are almost literally begging for a pardon. And he does grant them a lot of pardons. Here's why that's such a bad thing, besides the fact that he's being a petty leader. When he pardons these Confederate leaders can go back to the southern states that they were from, and they can have their land back. And when that happens, all of the freedmen that thought they were about to get land of their own, all of a sudden, there's no land left to give them because all the major landowners in the South have gotten their land back. One thing that he will do, though, is he will get the southern states to pass the 13th Amendment as part of the conditions to be readmitted to the Union, which means that, yes, slavery will end in the southern states. But as you'll see in the next lecture, the southern states are going to replace slavery with a system that's very similar to slavery and in some ways even worse. What's Congress doing during all this time? Congress wanted to punish the South. They wanted to revolutionize the South, and in the end, Johnson, after he gets the Southern leaders to grovel to him, he's actually making this an even easier plan. Well, back then, Congress was in recess much more frequently, or at least for longer periods of time, and so Congress, with its radical Republicans, were in recess, and so Johnson admits lots of Southern states while Congress is gone. And as these southern states come into the Union, they know that they have to get rid of slavery, but they wanted to make sure that white Americans stayed above blacks in terms of their social status. And so a lot of southern states are going to start passing what are known as the black codes, which are a lot like the slave codes, except technically freedmen weren't slaves anymore. So what did these black codes do? They treated blacks and whites differently. They restricted what freedmen could do. For example, they could not vote. For example, they were not allowed to own guns. because there was a fear they might use the guns on whites. They were not allowed to serve on juries, because if they could serve on a jury, then that could mean they could pass some sort of judgment on a white person that was on trial. And so basically what the black codes were designed to do were to keep the whites at the top of Southern society and the blacks at the bottom, even if they couldn't be enslaved anymore. Obviously, when the radical Republicans return to Congress, they're going to be outraged by this because they wanted to have black equality, black suffrage, and not have blacks be treated the way Andrew Johnson was allowing. So when the radical Republicans came back from Congress, they were furious because the Southerners that had come back to Congress before the radical Republicans even had started to pass these black codes in their home states. And so what ends up happening is, and I'm not exactly sure how they went about this, how they had the power to do this, but when the radical Republicans came back to Congress, they basically refused, when they did a roll call, they refused to name the Southerners. They only listed the names of the Republicans and the Northerners and the Westerners. They refused to even name the Southerners, and then they kicked them out of Congress. And this is when the real political drama begins, because now the radical Republicans are going to start trying to pass laws that Andrew Johnson doesn't like. Now, if you've taken a civics class, you know that there can be a lot of fighting between the president and Congress over the passage of laws. You know that Congress can pass a law and that the president can veto that law, but if Congress has enough backing, they can actually override the veto. So let me real quickly set up how that mechanism works, and then we'll get into the fighting that happens. So if one more than half of each house of Congress passes a law, it can go to the president to be signed into law. If the president doesn't like it, he can veto, or she can veto that law, and it goes back to Congress. And then if Congress wants to override the veto, they have to get 2/3 of both houses of Congress to vote to override the veto, which is very hard to do. Eventually, the radical Republicans will have so much power in Congress, especially because they've kept the Southerners kicked out, that they'll be able to override Johnson's vetoes. Not quite yet, though. Okay, so the radical Republicans are going to try to pass a couple of laws that Andrew Johnson's not going to like. One of these laws will be the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and what that would do was say that all freedmen were citizens, and therefore, because they were citizens, they were entitled to equality. And if that was passed, then the black codes would become illegal. So this was a measure to undo the black codes and basically say that you can't pass a law that gives one race one kind of treatment and a different race a different kind of treatment. It says that all people in this country are citizens, at least if they're born here. More on that in a moment. And then once you're considered a citizen, then you are entitled to equal treatment regardless of race. Another thing that they are going to propose is a law to keep the Freedmen's Bureau around. There was an expiration date on it, basically, and the Freedmen's Bureau is set to expire, and the purpose was to keep the agency around long enough to help these ex-slaves actually and realistically adjust to freedom. And if you look at the political cartoon there, it kind of shows you Andrew Johnson's attitude towards the Freedmen's Bureau. In the end, Andrew Johnson is going to veto both of these bills. Remember, he did not care for the wealthy white ex-slave owning class. He didn't care for the wealthy whites. In fact, he spent a lot of his time making them grovel to him. But you can see also by his actions here that he did not care for the rights of freedmen either. So he vetoes both bills. And he's not going to be able to do vetoes effectively for very long, because you're about to have what's known as the midterm elections of 1866. So remember, every 2 years, the entire House of Representatives is up for re-election, and a third of the Senate is up for re-election. And Andrew Johnson's going to go around campaigning on against the radical Republicans, saying basically, he's going to use white supremacist arguments, basically saying that blacks are going to have way too much power and way too much equality if the radical Republicans win, so don't vote for them. Well, his plan is going to backfire, and the radical Republicans are going to win lots of seats in Congress. And with the Southerners still not in Congress because they've been kicked out, there are so many radical Republicans that they can basically override any veto that Andrew Johnson creates. And basically, they are a veto-proof Congress. And so what they will do is they will start to basically override lots of what Andrew Johnson wants. They are going to now hijack Reconstruction, and they are going to conduct Reconstruction the way they want to. And they are going to start pushing for something stronger than even the Civil Rights Act of 1866. They're going to approve the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment is basically a stronger version of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So remember, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is going to say that blacks have citizenship and thus they're entitled to equality. And even when Andrew Johnson wants to veto anything like this, it doesn't matter because his vetoes are now going to be overridden. Congress can basically run over the president legally. And also, they are going to create their own Reconstruction plan that will be much more aggressive and much more punishing of the South and much more revolutionary. Andrew Johnson doesn't like it. He is going to be very opposed to this, but whenever he vetoes the military Reconstruction plan, again, Congress will simply override it. And all of this was legal. Again, if over two-thirds of Congress wants to override a presidential veto, they can. So here we go to what I consider to be probably the most important amendment there is, at least outside of the original Bill of Rights, and that will be the 14th Amendment. And what it will do is it's going to define citizenship overall. It's going to say that if you are born in the United States, or if you are an immigrant and you go through the naturalization process, you become a citizen. Either way, you become a citizen. Now, in the context of the time, it is really aimed for freedmen, the people that had been slaves, all of which had been born in the United States. So basically what it does is it says that all people that were born here are citizens, and if you are a citizen, you are entitled to, quote, equal protection under the law. In other words, you are to be treated equally once you're a citizen, regardless of your racial status, regardless of how long you've been a citizen. Once you're a citizen, the law is supposed to treat you like every other citizen. You need to highlight and circle and draw stars. You need to highlight and emphasize the 14th Amendment, and honestly, the 13th Amendment as well. And when we get to the 15th Amendment, make sure you highlight that one as well. All three of the amendments you need to know. Very important, very significant. So what this will do, again, is it will define now all the freedmen as citizens, and now they are entitled to equality, which means that black codes are now illegal. If whites can own guns, then blacks can own guns. If whites can serve on juries, then blacks can serve on juries. If blacks are entitled to certain kinds of employment, both races are entitled to these kinds of employment. And what I will tell you is that in American history, too, you'll see the 14th Amendment come up again and again in major Supreme Court cases. For example, this picture here is from the 1950s. It deals with education, and it's going to rule that the segregation of races in public schools violates the 14th Amendment. So just note that the 14th Amendment will come up again and again. One more example while you're finishing up these notes is that in World War II, a lot of Japanese Americans are going to be put in internment camps because there's a fear that they might be spies for Japan. And basically, there's going to be a major Supreme Court case dealing with this issue because Japanese Americans are going to say that it violates the rights of citizens of Japanese descent. Again, more on this later on. Okay, so now the radical Republicans are going to take over. And one thing to note is that there is another radical Republican besides Thaddeus Stevens that is a leader. It's a man that you might remember. His name is Charles Sumner, the man that had been beaten nearly to death and been put in a coma during the 1850s. By this point, he had recovered, and he will kind of get the good karma of being a leader of the radical Republicans along with Thaddeus Stevens and help with the revolutionizing of the South and trying to give blacks equality. Okay, so the Reconstruction plan that the radical Republicans are going to put in place. It's going to be called military reconstruction. It's going to be put in place under the Military Reconstruction Act, and it will be much harsher towards the southern states. It is going to emphasize more of a punishing of the South. It is going to also make sure that the South gets revolutionized in terms of race relations. So again, this will be harsher. There will be the use of the military in order to enforce this. What are the details? Well, first off, the southern states had to ratify the 14th Amendment. They had to say that freedmen were not second-class citizens. They had to say that there were no such thing as black codes. They had to give blacks that had been ex-slaves citizenship. And you have to remember that among many white Southerners, this is a total about face to what they're used to culturally. What they used to view as property is now not only no longer their property, but considered an equal citizen. And you will see Southern resistance among Southern whites, and I'll get into that in the final lecture of this unit. That will be the next lecture. More on that later. Another thing that the radical Republicans are going to force upon the southern states is they're going to say that the freedmen have to be allowed to vote. Now, what's interesting and slightly hypocritical is that a lot of northern states didn't allow blacks to vote, but now it's being demanded of the southern states. So that's an interesting little piece of side knowledge there. Regardless, the southern states are now being told they have to allow freedmen to vote. And if freedmen can vote, that means that they can also run for office. That means they can even have political power. So again, this is going to turn Southern society on its head, and suddenly you have a lot of people that have been considered property, not only being considered equals, but now they can actually have power over whites, and white society is going to resist this. And so to help curb the Southern resistance, the South is going to be divided up into military districts. And these military districts are going to be put under the control of Union generals. And so basically, the southern states are not going to be free of the military. Now the military is there not to fight battles, but to enforce a much more strict and revolutionary form of Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson is going to try to veto all of these bills, all of these laws. In fact, the Military Reconstruction Act is going to say that when it comes to Reconstruction, these generals don't report to their commander-in-chief, the president. They report directly to Congress. Is that constitutional? That's very debatable. Regardless, the radical Republicans are running all over the president. And they really want to get the president out of the way because he continues to oppose vocally these rules. He continues to try to veto these bills, even though the vetoes are being overridden. And then the radical Republicans are going to push what some would say would be too far. So the radical Republicans are going to hatch a type of conspiracy to try to get Andrew Johnson out of their way so that they can do basically whatever they want. And again, what they do is very political, and even though what they wanted for black Americans was the right thing, their way of going about it, that whether or not that was right, that's debatable. So what they will do is they intentionally pass a law that, by the way, much later on the Supreme Court said was unconstitutional, and it was called the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act basically said that the president had to get permission from Congress before removing anybody from his cabinet or her cabinet, and there's nowhere in the Constitution that says that, but they make it a law. And they knew that Andrew Johnson would be upset with this law. They knew that he would break this law, so they were deliberately setting him up. And Andrew Johnson did have some people in his cabinet that he didn't like, including radical Republicans. And so what he's going to do is he will challenge this law, and he is going to fire the Secretary of War, who was, I believe, a radical Republican, knowing full well that Congress is going to try to impeach him over this. But he basically wasn't going to take this challenge lying down, and he was going to face Congress, and so he does break the law, and he does get impeached. Now, impeachment, a lot of people confuse that with conviction. To be impeached does not mean you're kicked out of office. It means that you are charged with a crime. Bill Clinton, much later on in the 1990s, was also impeached. It does not mean he was kicked out of office. But this becomes if you will, the highest level of political drama. And whenever an impeachment happens, the House of Representatives decides whether or not to press charges, and that's what happens. They do impeach Johnson. He is going to have charges basically pressed against him for breaking this law. From there, the Senate has to conduct the trial. So this is a very politically dramatic scene. You see Andrew Johnson being put on trial. The jury is the Senate. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is the judge that presides over all of this. And by the way, you could have gotten a ticket to watch all of this go down. You do have a right as a citizen to observe what happens in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. So does he survive his trial in the Senate? And the answer is going to be yes by one vote. How does Andrew Johnson, as unpopular as he was, manage to survive his impeachment trial? Well, one reason is that he does some wheeling and dealing behind the scenes to get some people to vote not guilty. However, there are some radical Republicans that could not stand Andrew Johnson, but they also knew that if they voted guilty and got him kicked out of office, they would set a very, very dangerous precedent for the future, which would have been that basically any time that Congress didn't like a president, they could just set the president up with an unfair law that they could then impeach and convict him for and then get him kicked out of office. So, for example, if Congress didn't like the president and knew that the president liked to go golfing, which a lot of presidents historically have liked doing, Congress could pass a law saying that the president's not allowed to play golf, which would be an unconstitutional law. There's nothing in the Constitution that says what the president does in his or her free time. So if they passed that law just so they could get that president out of office, then they would really be getting rid of him for political reasons, not because that person had actually committed a real crime. And radical Republicans even realized that what they were doing here was a sort of political assassination, and it was not right, and it would have upset the checks and balances between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Had they gone through with this, then any time in the future that Congress doesn't like the president, they could just impeach and convict the president and get the president out of the way and put in place the person they wanted instead. And forever that would have undone checks and balances and undone separation of powers. So highlight that last piece. It sets up the precedent that you cannot impeach or convict a president simply because you don't like them. They actually have to commit a crime to be impeached and convicted. As unpopular as he was, he continues to be president. That being said, in the election of 1868, he's sick of being president and he will not run. He's not even going to be nominated by his own party. And in the end, a radical Republican named Ulysses S. Grant, you may know that name. He was the best general that the Union had during the Civil War, at least the most effective one. And he is at this point a war hero, and so it's going to be pretty much a shoo-in to become president. If you look here, he is going to win almost 3/4 of the Electoral College vote. What you'll notice is that he does get some Southern votes. How does he get North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida's votes, Alabama's votes? Why? Because of military Reconstruction, your freedmen could vote. And the freedmen loved Grant because he's the one that had made emancipation a reality for them. So you even see him winning some southern states. Now, why doesn't Virginia or Mississippi or Texas get any votes? You notice there's no number there. It's because they had not been readmitted to the Union yet. They were considered, as the key says, unreconstructed states. So Grant becomes president, even though he was considered at this point to have been a great general. He will go down in history as one of the worst presidents of all time. Just because he's a good general does not mean he's going to be a good president, and you'll see more of that in the next lecture. But here he is, radical Republican. He becomes president. Now the radical Republicans in Congress have someone they can work with and someone that will support their policies. So you'll see here we're going to get into another double-lined chart, which means we're about to talk about another Civil War amendment, which means you need to highlight it. So the last of the Civil War or Reconstruction amendments is going to be the 15th Amendment, which is going to give all races the right to vote. What it's going to say is that all races have, or it's going to say you cannot deny the right to vote based on race. Now, a lot of Southerners didn't like that. You can see they drew some very disrespectful caricatures of black politicians. Again, Southerners did not like this. Here is a painting of the first class of black congressmen. What's interesting is that one of these men, I believe it's this one here, Hiram Revels, he will be elected. He will be the first black senator ever elected. And he is going to take the old Senate seat. This is very poetic. He's going to take the old Senate seat of ex-Senator Jefferson Davis. As you can see, there will be many black senators. There will be many blacks also elected to the House of Representatives. And this is a huge deal. These people, a decade earlier, had been slaves. They had been considered property. And now they are working in the federal government to make policy, to make laws. So Southern freedmen now have the right to vote. They can even run for political office, which means they can have power over the South, power over Southern states. They will become mayors in some towns. They could potentially become governors of some states because freemen can vote. And the white South is not going to have this. They already did not like their so-called property being taken from them and now being called citizens. Now they're being ruled by what they saw as their ex-property, and you will see Southern white resistance really start to pick up. You will see, for example, the creation of the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. I'll talk more about that later on. So Republicans, partly, to be honest, did this for political reasons because they knew that if they gave blacks all these rights, they would get black votes for a long time if blacks continue to vote. So it was partly to give the Republican Party power, and they will milk this for several decades. That being said, again, the radical Republicans are giving blacks votes they had never seen before in the South. And at the same time, like I said before, Southern resistance among whites is about to accelerate big time. You will see the creation of the Klan. You will see terrorist activity from the Klan. And honestly, in a sense, the Klan is going to win this battle. So basically what happens is that the Southern whites are going to start to resist all of these changes. They will resist this change with violence. And over time, the Northern morale is going to be weak. Remember how when it came to the Civil War, how the Northern states, they didn't really promote the Civil War very strongly over time because they got tired of it. The same thing's going to happen when it comes to Reconstruction, because whenever the Klan and other white supremacist groups start to resist the fair treatment of blacks, the Northern states are going to say, we're tired of using our troops, we're tired of using our military to support Reconstruction, and in the end, they will give up and turn their backs on a lot of these Southern blacks. And so you see here this picture of Southern blacks voting. That's not going to last for very long. And as one historian has put it, the North won the Civil War, and as you'll see in the next lecture, the South is going to largely win Reconstruction. And Reconstruction ultimately, in reality, is going to fail for the next 100 years or so. More on that in the next lecture.